Hello and welcome to WION's Global Leadership Series. With me today is the Prime Minister of Armenia, Mr. Nikol Phashinyan, and it's good to have you on WION. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
We're glad to be with you. Thank you.
The clashes in Azerbaijan have entered the fourth week. 2 ceasefire attempts have failed. Are you preparing for a long-drawn battle?
This is a war which was imposed upon us in the context of the ceasefire agreement. Armenia has been honoring her commitments. It is Azerbaijan which fails to honor its commitments, and this has reasons. The problem is that currently in the war against Nagorno-Karabakh, we see not only Azerbaijan but also Turkey involved, and as well as mercenaries and terrorists brought to the conflict zone by Turkey. You can only imagine essentially what a confusing and chaotic situation it is that we're seeing. We also have information about armed fighters from Pakistan taking part in the war against Nagorno-Karabakh. And perhaps the multi-layered nature of this situation is one reason why we cannot achieve stabilization. As to the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, they have no choice in this situation but to use all possible means to the very end to defend themselves, as long as there is no diplomatic solution, until the time when diplomatic solution of the issue can be provided.
In an address to the nation, you said, and I'm quoting, the Karabakh issue, at least at this stage, has no diplomatic solution. What then is the solution?
To solve this issue, we need mutual concessions. And every time Armenia expresses willingness to make any concession, in other words, even a bit lowering of the bar on the Armenian side, Azerbaijan comes up with new demands and new conditions. It has been the case since a long time in the negotiations. It is currently the case by saying that currently diplomatic solution is not available. I refer to Azerbaijan's non-constructive position. Azerbaijan has not been and is not ready for any solution of the issue based on mutual concessions. As soon as Azerbaijan is ready for that position, we will, I think, at that time have some success. But so long as that's not the posture, that's not the position, it's very hard to achieve diplomatic solution. That, of course, does not mean that we stop working in that direction. We shall continue to work in that direction.
But Azerbaijan has accused Armenia of breaking the truce. How do you respond to that charge?
Well, you see, in those cases, nobody says, yes, I was the one breaking the truce. But I ask a question, I ask a simple, logical chain to be built. The fact that the war was started by Azerbaijan is a fact. It is also a fact that Azerbaijan has on its side armed terrorists fighting on its side. It is a fact. I don't know of armed terrorists engaging in any zone in order to achieve truce. And thirdly, every time there is an understanding reached on truce, on ceasefire, Turkey publicly states it thinks Azerbaijan should not stop the fighting, should not stop the hostilities. As we build this logical chain, we can very quickly infer who it is that fails to respect the ceasefire.
Keep coming back to the issue of armed terrorists, and that is a very significant matter here, including those from Pakistan. And you say you cannot talk to the Pakistanis because there are no diplomatic ties, but I'm sure you can ask the international community to try and bring that pressure on countries like Pakistan to stop this export and to stop these armed terrorists from worsening the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What are you doing in that direction?
With respect to that problem, we have shared all of the information with our international counterparts. And in the international media, there have been publications already which prove that terrorists and mercenaries from Syria are taking part in the Karabakh war. International organizations have been informed already. A number of countries have officially acknowledged that there are terrorists and mercenaries in the conflict zone. and they have already expressed their concern over this. And of course, the international community should strictly condemn these actions and these practices and take specific measures to put an end to the presence of terrorists in this region.
Armenia's president visited the NATO headquarters, but he seemed to have returned empty-handed, with the NATO chief saying that this alliance will remain neutral as far as the conflict is concerned. What then are your options?
Turkey is a member of NATO, and I think that the actions which Turkey is now taking in the war against Nagorno-Karabakh impose a certain responsibility on NATO as well. Today, the International Human Rights Watch has stated that Azerbaijan is using prohibited ammunitions, cluster bombs, in the Karabakh conflict zone, and these are grave violations of international law. When a member state of NATO is engaged, when a member state of NATO is transporting mercenaries and terrorists to the conflict zone to start a war against Nagorno-Karabakh, then NATO has direct responsibility. NATO must answer these questions. After all, how it feels about one of its member states recruiting terrorists and mercenaries and transporting them to a conflict zone, and secondly, taking part in a process in which prohibited weapons are being used, rocket shelling civilian population.
Would you say that multilateral organizations and alliances like the NATO and the United Nations seem to fail in situations like these?
You see, this is an ongoing problem for quite some time now, and experience has shown that those operations are not necessarily effective, and these types of organizations very often do not have sufficient leverage to impact the situation. That's why we think that in this situation, one possible way out could be the deployment of Russian peacekeeping troops in the conflict zone. And we think the international community, namely the OSCE, Minsk Group co-chair countries, should support and encourage so that the Russian peacekeeping troops are deployed in the conflict zone. Because otherwise, we will not see any specific action to prevent or stop this humanitarian crisis.
You mentioned Turkey, and you've said a lot about Turkey's role. Turkey is being accused of human rights violations in this conflict. Is there evidence, Prime Minister, to corroborate these allegations?
Are you asking about evidence of Turkish participation? Yes, of course, there is specific evidence and there is proof. This war has become the continuation, really, of the Turkish-Azerbaijani joint military exercise, which they began as early as in August. Turkey essentially does not conceal its engagement in the process. Turkey's highest officials have stated that they support Azerbaijan in the battlefield, and Turkish armed forces representatives and Turkish military equipment, namely the Turkish Bayraktar UAVs, and about a dozen of those have been shot down by the self-defense forces of Nagorno-Karabakh. And so all of this bears testament, it witnesses to Turkey's engagement in the process. Further evidence of Turkey's recruitment of mercenaries and terrorists from Syria and their transportation to the conflict zone, with dozens of facts having already been unveiled. We collected them and we presented them to the international community. By the way, one more important point. The European Court of Human Rights, based on our application, has adopted a decision in which it finds that proven that Turkey is engaged in the process.
So Pakistani terrorists are fighting. Turkey is sending Syrian proxies to fight on behalf of Azerbaijan. Turkey's vice president Fuat Oktay has now said that Ankara will not hesitate to send soldiers and provide military support for Azerbaijan if such a request is made. Is Armenia prepared to counter the Turkish forces if they openly join this conflict?
In
practice, they are already engaged, and the defense army of Nagorno-Karabakh to this point has withstood those forces. But this war, as I said, is imposed on the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, and they have no choice other than to defend their lives and their rights, up to the point when the international community undertakes specific measures to put an end to this war and to this violence.
In a previous interview, you've said, and I'm quoting, Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh are facing an existential threat. You've compared President Erdogan to Hitler. You've accused him of engaging in a genocide. But the global community has not recognized your position on Nagorno-Karabakh. How do you then plan to take your case forward?
I think
that what is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh and Turkey's presence are a continuation of Turkey's genocidal policy towards the Armenians. You know that in 1915, in Ottoman Turkey, genocide of the Armenians was carried out. Many countries of the world have officially recognized the genocide. As a result of that genocide, there was ethnic cleansing on very large territories. And it is now my assessment that 100 years later, Turkey has returned to the South Caucasus to continue the genocidal policy against the Armenians. And this pursues a very concrete, pragmatic objective in that the Armenians in the South Caucasus are the last obstacle to Turkey's imperialistic policies to the south, east, and to the southeast to be continued. And in this context, indeed, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh are facing an existential threat. And we think that in this context, the best and most pragmatic solution of the problem would be remedial cessation for salvation and for provision of the security of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Do you at some point, or do you feel that this is Armenia being caught in a proxy war between Russia and Turkey?
No, I could not say that, because Russia is not engaged in this war, and Russia is acting as a co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group. The OSCE Minsk Group is the only internationally recognized format in which the Karabakh issue is to be discussed and solved. Russia is indeed Armenia's strategic partner, but it is not engaged in the war. It is engaged as a mediator in the OSCE Minsk Group for resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue and for achieving peace and stability in the region.
Russia did try to mediate peace. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is said to meet the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan. So we've had a Russian-led peace initiative, now an American-led effort, two peace processes, and yet no peace.
I think that the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs should bring together their efforts for resolving this issue and not act with separate initiatives. And I think it would be correct in this situation for the OSCE Minsk Group co-chair countries, which are the United States and France, to support the other co-chair country, Russia, in Russia's peacemaking efforts, and not to try to initiate separate peace processes or peace initiatives. Russia is closer to the region. Russia is present in the region. Russia has more effective tools for specifically influencing this situation.
So will you not participate in a US-led peace process if that's what Washington insists on?
We do participate, of course. We do participate. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs is already in Washington, is set to meet Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I just explained our position that the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs should act in the same direction and not in different directions.
Last year, you visited Nagorno-Karabakh and you called for the reunification of Armenia with Karabakh. That position of yours has not been recognized by the United Nations. Do you feel the global community is going to back you after this?
We
need, first of all, to know the history of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, at this stage, emerged in 1988 during the democratization process of the Soviet Union when Mikhail Gorbachev had undertaken a perestroika process in the Soviet Union. And that perestroika process implied democracy. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, who have always been 80+% of the population of that region, decided to exercise the possibility of restoring their violated rights. Now, what rights were violated is that in the period of creation of the Soviet Union, this Nagorno-Karabakh, with over 80% Armenian population, was put inside Soviet Azerbaijan and not inside Soviet Armenia. This was a consequence of an arbitrary decision by Stalin. And in 1988, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh started a peaceful process, the purpose of which was, as a result of which, the autonomous district of Nagorno-Karabakh parliament adopted a decision on reunification with Armenia, and the Armenian people considered this a historic decision because the Armenian parliament too adopted a similar decision. As to the international community, I think the international community should acknowledge the facts, and the most important fact here is that today Nagorno-Karabakh is fighting a war, among others, against international terrorists. And in this sense, Nagorno-Karabakh is standing in a war against international terrorism. It is standing at a civilizational front line, and I believe the international community should apply the principle of remedial cessation.
Do you expect India to support your position on Nagorno-Karabakh, and what sort of support do you expect from New Delhi?
Yes, I
already said what I expect from the international community and what I expect of the others. I expect also of New Delhi to acknowledge that Turkey organized the transportation of terrorists and mercenaries to Azerbaijan, and that without Turkey this war would not have started, and that Turkey and the terrorist organizations and Azerbaijan have initiated the offensive, and to acknowledge that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh are facing an existential threat and the threat of a genocide. And in this context, to find that remedial cessation is applicable for Nagorno-Karabakh and to recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh.
How long do you think this is going to continue? Because as I want to end with where I began from. Ceasefire efforts have failed. Peace efforts have not yielded peace, really. How long a war or a conflict have you prepared yourselves for?
The
Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, as I said, will fight till the end to defend their security, but I hope that our diplomatic efforts will stop the war as soon as possible.
Prime Minister Phashinyan, thanks very much for being with us.
Yes,
thank you.